You are going to learn how to read people in 5 or 10 minutes using the 5-factor model, also known as Ocean. And the reason we want to use this model is because it's the only scientifically backed model, which means it has predictive value. Once you know someone's big 5, their major traits that they're expressing, you'll have a better understanding of how they see the world, and you'll be able to predict their future behaviors and their life outcomes. It's very powerful stuff. So in this video, we're going to cover 3 major pieces. The first piece we're going to cover is we're going to talk about the model itself, just give a very quick overview on how it came up and what its strengths and weaknesses are. And then the second thing we're going to do is we're going to go trait by trait and show you what to look for, what the markers are for extroverts or people that are high in openness or highly conscientious or highly neurotic, etc. Then the third thing we're going to talk about is how to improve the model, make the model so much better than it is. Because the model, of course, is great, but people are different. They have different beliefs and attitudes. They have different cultures, and their identity is different. And so we want to take that into account, and we'll show you exactly how to do that. So before we begin, if you haven't taken the test, the personality test, there's a free link below. You can take the test for free. And also, if you like this sort of content, be sure to subscribe and like the button and share it because it helps out tremendously. So let's start. What is the model and how did it begin? So the Big 5 was never a theory. It came out of language, and it assumes that all the different words that are used to describe people's traits and personalities are the ones that exist. And scientists in the early 90s noticed that these words generally line up in 5 major buckets. For example, smiling and being happy went together. Being extroverted and being assertive went together. Being creative and liking art and music went together. And then in the 2000s, neurologists found out that there was a biological component to the model. For example, extroverts receive dopamine hits whenever they engage in goal-seeking behavior. Their brain literally rewards them. So they're wired to be more extroverted. And this also pertains to the other traits as well. So here's a quick overview of how the model works. So the model sits in between these 2 parts. First, the model has a strong genetic basis to it, which ranges anywhere from like 0.4 to 0.6 for each trait in terms of how heritable it is. And then the rest of it's going to be environmental factors, right? So you have these 2 forces that shape the person's personality. And the environmental factors include things like character adaptations. That is, how a person has changed to the environment and improved their personality, or in some cases, they've improved some of their traits, they've added to themselves, or they maybe have patterns that are not very effective. They have maladaptive traits. And so whenever a situation arises, okay, first one part of that situation gets filtered through the Big 5, and then also gets filtered through the character adaptations, and then you end up having the behavior that emerges from it. So what areas are included in the character adaptations? We're looking at things like someone's beliefs, their culture, their attitudes, and their sense of identity, who they believe they are. So here's a quick example of how this can change over time and how the 2 play together. So imagine that a small kid who's, let's say, 50-50 in terms of how conscientious he is. In other words, hardworking, organized, how well they plan, carry out tasks, and so on. Imagine they grow up in a very conscientious environment and that the parents reward them every time they get a good grade. So in 1st grade, maybe in the beginning, the kid doesn't do so well. He comes home, he gets punished. Now he does better at school, he gets rewarded. And what ends up happening is that from a bottom-up approach, this kid over time will learn to be more conscientious. And it's going to happen naturally. Like, he's going to start studying for school more. He's going to get better test grades. He's going to get rewarded. He's going to learn that studying works, so he's going to have a positive belief system about studying. He's going to get positive feedback from the other people at school, like his teachers. Other people are going to see him as smart, so it's going to validate that this is a good way of moving forward in the world. And then, in turn, this is going to make him even more conscientious. The next time there's a test, he's going to study a little bit harder. He'll get a little bit better grade. His parents are going to reward him a little bit more. And then you've created a positive loop cycle. And within a very short amount of time, this is also going to become part of the kid's identity. He's going to think of himself as a good student and a smart kid. And the one or two times he starts getting a bad grade, it's going to hurt him. He's going to experience some sort of pain. It's not going to match up with the way he sees himself. So this is a great example of how traits can evolve over time and how the environment can really impact your traits. So when we're looking at this, we want to know it both on the biological end of the spectrum, but we also want to know what some of those beliefs are because they really open up different boxes. So now let's go to part 2 and look at the traits themselves. There's 5 major traits: extroversion, openness, agreeableness, neuroticism, and conscientiousness. Now I have videos if you want to do a deep dive in any one of these, and we spend about 30 minutes and we try to show you what it's like from the inside out. So here's a quick overview though. Extroverts basically are people that think in stories and they're goal-driven. They tend to be on the assertive side of things. They're enthusiastic. They have a lot of positive emotion, and positive emotion is used to help them achieve their goals. Every time they get closer to their goal, their brain releases dopamine. They feel energetic. They feel invigorated. They move closer and closer to the goal. And then they get the goal, and then they get washed with some more dopamine. And that, again, creates a positive loop cycle. The next time they have something to move forward towards another goal, they experience the same sort of set of factors, and they assertively move towards it. They also have a lot of enthusiasm. They're, happiness. They tend to be the happy-go-lucky people. Next, creativity, which is high openness. This is associated with both the creative elements and also the intellectualism. So people that are high in openness tend to be very creative. They like to open up and explore the unknown. They like to unpack ideas and unpack art and beauty for its own sake. And they like to move into the unknown in this way. They're driven by their curiosity and their need to use their minds. They have a strong need for cognition, and then they also want to express it in the world. So they're very prone to leaving things behind at work for things that are new and exciting. And oftentimes they're the people that are, actors, comedians, artists, musicians, entrepreneurs. They're the ones that are creating a lot of the cool new things in the world. Next, neuroticism. Quick overview for neuroticism. This is kind of like the fear response. Imagine you're walking through the jungle and you hear like a ruffling in the bushes. Now, it could be a butterfly or it could be a lion, right? And it's probably better that you assume the worst because you won't get hurt that way. If you assume the best and you're wrong, you will die. If you assume the worst and you're wrong, you'll live. So it's better to be cautious. And that's how people that are high in neuroticism approach life. They see the potential risks in everyday situations. And they have 2 major responses. They either freeze and they just stop. And an example of this would be procrastination, withdrawal, or they have a defensive aggression, which would be moody, volatile, getting angry. Next, agreeableness. Agreeableness is people that genuinely like other people. They like working with other people. They don't want to rock the boat. And they're kind of like the social glue. You could think of them as nurses or kindergarten teachers. They like to, they're both very compassionate and polite. And they like to move forward with people as a group. And then last but not least is conscientiousness. Conscientiousness has 2 major facets: orderliness and industriousness. Orderly people like to plan and organize, and industrious people take those plans and they bring them into life. They work really hard to get from point A to point B. They also don't give up. They have a lot of grit, and they're very, very hardworking. They have this sense of duty to work. They have a hard time retiring, for example. So that's a quick overview of the big 5. I have a video right here you can watch as we do a much better, deeper dive in the big 5. So now, how will you know if you meet one of these 5 major traits? And the best way to think about people is like this. No one is just one thing, but everyone has a dominant trait, okay? And through that dominant trait is going to be predominantly how they see the world. So for example, an extrovert is literally going to see the world through a story narrative and through a goal-seeking paradigm, and they're going to be moving through life towards the things that they want in this fashion. People that are high in openness, they're looking for things that are novel, and they notice the beauty, and they know in nature. They notice the things that are interesting. They're always looking to unpack new boxes, new ideas. They're very motivated by cognition. They're very motivated by their curiosity. So once you know the person's main trait, what you want to do is you want to figure out what some of the other traits are, and then have an idea of how these traits play together, because some of them are going to be complementary, some of them are not going to be so complementary. So here's how we do it. First, for extroversion, people that are assertive are going to do these things a lot, and these are big markers for it. First is they're going to be very bold, they're going to be the first to take action, and they're also going to give you their opinion without even being asked for it. So imagine you're in a group setting and someone is, always taking action, the first to act, the first to speak. They're bold, they're assertive. That's a big marker for assertiveness. Enthusiasm, imagine someone that's very gregarious. They use their hands a lot. They might be touchy-feely. They have a lot of gestures. They're very animated. They like to talk to groups of people. These are markers for enthusiasm. Someone that is generally fun-loving and in a good mood. Other actions that you'll notice about people that are extroverts, they tend to be impulsive. They also tend to be spontaneous and thrill-seeking. So since you know this, that's one way you can test if someone is more on the extroversion side. You can see if they'd be up for something fun and new and exciting, and a lot of times they will be. In terms of their language, they're going to tell stories that focus on people. And the stories are going to have a positive sentiment to them. In other words, they're not being critical of others. And they're going to have a lot of these words that are even sexual in nature. So they might talk a lot more about people. They might talk a lot more about sex than the other types. They're going to talk a lot more emotionally than the other types. And they're going to tell a lot more stories than the other types. So hope that gives you an idea of extroversion. Next, openness. People that are high in openness are motivated by creativity, intellectualism, and they're doing it for its own pursuit. And they have this need for cognition. And so when they go out, and you'll know the biggest marker for someone that is high in openness is they're looking for other people to meet and talk to and have really deep conversations with them. People high in openness have a broad set of interests, and they have a depth of understanding of these interests, and these interests are very integrated amongst themselves. So one way to know that someone's high in openness is they're going to easily be able to jump from topic to topic and connect them in ways that most people wouldn't think to connect them. They're going to see the underneath connections between things. Also, in terms of appearance, they might be distinctive. They might be beautiful in a way. They might have beauty in mind, aesthetics in mind. They might have a messy look. They might look unique. In terms of intellect, they'll be philosophical, deep, breadth. That's what they're going to look for. Verbally, they're going to have a high IQ verbally. They're going to be very expressive in their writing. So if you're looking at a post online and everyone's writing 2 or 3 sentences and someone wrote 3 paragraphs and it's well thought out, and it's well written and it uses a lot of big words, probably high in openness on the intellectual side. In terms of words, they're going to use words that pertain to these 2 domains, both the aesthetic domain and the intellectual domain. On the intellectual domain, they might use words like believing, knowledge, philosophy, knowing, concepts. On the sensory side, they might use words like delicious, sour, insatiable, things that you could almost feel and taste. In terms of action, they have a propensity to seek novelty. So, and they're curious. So one way to test to see if someone is high in openness is you can throw out a couple of interesting ideas and see how interested and how much they jump into them. Someone that is high in openness is going to be like, giving candy to a baby. Like it's going to be irresistible. So that's how you know someone's high in openness. The other thing high openness people is like, they'll look away a little bit more. Whereas someone that's high in extroversion, they're going to have more direct eye contact with you, especially in the first meeting. Another thing about extroverts is they're more likely to dress for success. So you'll notice in terms of their physical presentation, might be a little bit more flamboyant than the other types. But in that sort of like dress for success sort of way. Whereas high openness is going to be more of a distinctive, unique look. Now let's look at conscientiousness. So conscientiousness is people that have this duty to contribute. They're very well organized. They're industrious. In terms of their appearance, they're going to be very neat and clean, very orderly. In terms of attire, very formal. In terms of their language, they're going to be both formal and polite. They're not going to use swear words. They're most likely going to keep to the rules, to whatever social rules there are in that environment. They might even use, polite language like informal language like sir, and so on. The two biggest ways to know that someone is conscientious is first is that they're punctual. And then the reason why punctuality is such a big marker for high conscientiousness is because it literally hits on the four major facets of conscientiousness. First, it shows that someone has the ability to plan and organize their schedule so they can show up to be on time. The second thing that they're capable of doing is being industrious enough to carry out a plan, and who knows what challenges they might have faced that day. The third piece is that they're responsible. In other words, they owe it to the people that they're meeting at that time and day to show up on time. In other words, they're being considerate. And then four, they have the self-discipline to do all of these things instead of like being on their phone for an extra 5 minutes or watching an extra YouTube video or whatever other distraction might be there. So someone being consistently punctual is a good marker for conscientiousness. There are people that are very self-disciplined and they're great at impulse control. So what that means is they're able to readily sacrifice the present for the future. And so if you gave them something that was very tempting, there's a good chance that someone that's highly conscientious will weigh out, the cost benefits, and they're the ones that most easily say no to temptations. Next up, we'll go over agreeableness. Now, agreeableness, this is one of the more interesting types, and that's because they genuinely care about other people, and they're both compassionate and they're also polite, right? So on the compassionate side, they're going to generally show a genuine interest in you. So they'll ask you questions about you. Not only will they ask you questions about you, they're going to be able to empathize with you. If you told them some interesting story, they're really going to be able to put themselves in your shoes. And the biggest marker for high agreeableness is that they like to do things for other people. So if you ask them to do you a favor, they would very much like to do that because that's their way of contributing. On the politeness side, they're not going to be rude. Okay, they're not going to be condescending. They're not going to get into arguments. In fact, they're going to kind of give you a false positive, if anything. Like, even if you say something outlandish, they're more likely to just go, oh, okay, I see how you could see that, or something along those lines. They try to avoid conflict. So, in a sense, they're the ones that don't want to rock the boat. The other way you'll know that you're talking to someone agreeable is by the things that they don't do. So some of the things they don't do, they're not blunt. They're also not very competitive, right? They're not looking to get into a tussle with you or one-up you or anything like that. And they're not going to dominate you either. So they're not putting their needs above yours, and they don't think that they're better than you, okay? They're going to see you as equal, and if anything, if there's a negotiation between you and someone that's agreeable, the person that's agreeable is going to take the other person's argument, the other person's side very easily. They're going to almost be able to argue from your point of view as well as you can. And last but not least, neuroticism. So how does neuroticism, what's the best way to think about it? It's the fear response. And, we talked about earlier, you're confronted with a situation that might be dangerous, and then there's two natural responses to this. One is withdrawal. In other words, you freeze. It's freezing behavior. The other one is that you get ready for a fight, which is the volatile behavior. And this is kind of a defensive aggression. So people that are high in neuroticism are more likely to see problems in the world and prepare for them. And there's a lot of value in that. So how do you know that someone is high in neuroticism when you're out in a setting with other people? One is that they're going to be shy. They might blush more often. You might see them as being uncomfortable, anxious. They might have the sort of body language that is soothing, self-soothing. Another way you'll know that someone is volatile is that they're moody. Their moods are constantly changing. They're unsure. They worry a lot. In terms of their language, when you propose something new or interesting, they might be uncertain about it. They might be a little afraid to do it. It's hard to get them to move forward. When they talk, they express a lot of self-doubt. So these are the ways that you know someone's high neuroticism. Now, let's talk a little bit about each one and how they work with the other ones, because no one is just one thing, right? So once you know what someone's main type is, then you can kind of get an idea of what his other types are. And then you can kind of understand that the dynamic of personalities that's happening within this person. The other thing to note is that when you're looking at the Big Five and you're running through this test, what you really want to do is, first you want to notice these markers that we just talked about. Once you have a thesis, a theory that someone, let's say, is a high extroversion, you want to test it. And once you test it and you validate that they're pretty high in extroversion, then you go to the next one that you think is the highest and so on. And then you could even compare them against each other and find out, where they are relatively to each trait. And then the other thing you want to note is that anyone can do their homework for a night. That doesn't make them a conscientious person. Instead, what you want to see is this behavior consistently over time. So this is the most important part, that there's a consistency over time to it. Now let's look at how these traits play together and which ones are complementary. So extroversion plays pretty well with openness. In fact, a lot of people that are very inspirational are high in extroversion and also high in creativity and openness. And that's because they can think outside the box, and then they have the gregariousness and the charm to get people excited about their idea or their vision. Maybe like a Steve Jobs would be a good example of this. And Steve Jobs was also very assertive, so he knew how to move forward. Now, on the other side of it, Steve Jobs was also disagreeable. He was very, very competitive. He wanted to win. So he ended up running people over to some degree. So now you could see kind of how someone that's very assertive and disagreeable, what that dynamic would look like. You would have someone that's very focused on achieving their goals without having a lot of compassion and empathy, and without caring about being polite. And this sort of dynamic could be a little bit more on the dangerous side, because they're going to be aggressive without much of a stop to it, and they're more likely to run people over. In terms of creativity and openness, this has two major dimensions to it. And one of them is that it's both outward facing and inward facing. So when someone that's high in openness looks out, they're really trying to understand the world and get a big picture view of how things work. And when they look inside, they have a real depth of feeling. And in order to do this, they're constantly smashing open conceptual boxes, conceptual frameworks, beliefs. And this really drives people that are high in conscientiousness mad, because people in high conscientiousness like everything to be really well organized. And they like to stick to tradition, to stick to the things that they know have worked all this time and helped get us here. So there's a natural conflict between high openness and high conscientiousness. And that's why you'll see a lot of early stage entrepreneurs like Silicon Valley tech startups. Their founders are going to be high in openness and not so high in conscientiousness. They're going to have that sort of dynamic a little in that way. So, and that's for that reason. Now, conscientiousness, how does it play with the other traits? So conscientiousness is great at moderating impulses, okay? And that's because they have the self-discipline portion to it. Whereas people that are high in extroversion tend to be more impulsive, thrill-seeking. People that are high in neuroticism also tend to be more impulsive, but on the other side, out of fear. Like fear of missing out, for example, is a good example of this. So if someone is high in conscientiousness, they could moderate their impulsiveness on those two sides a little bit more. If someone is high in neuroticism but low in conscientiousness, they're going to have a harder time moderating their impulsive behavior. If you want to learn more about neuroticism, I've done a full deep dive right here. And next, let's look at neuroticism and extroversion. So in essence, extroversion is a all the positive emotions, and that are desire related, and neuroticism, all the fear emotions that have negative feelings associated. And this also, seeps down into how a person sees themselves, whether they're confident about moving forward or whether they have a lot of self-doubt about moving forward. And if you look at both, and if someone's higher in extroversion and lower in neuroticism, essentially that's going to be their self-esteem, right? Their self-esteem might be something like extroversion minus neuroticism, positive emotions of self versus negative emotions of self. If they're higher in neuroticism, they're obviously going to be, it might be a negative. If you want to learn more about extroversion, I've created this deep dive here. And then last but not least, agreeableness. So how does agreeableness play with the other traits? Well, we've already touched about how it plays with extroversion. And the thing about agreeableness and disagreeableness is that if you get really, really low on the disagreeableness scale, or I should say high on disagreeableness and low on agreeableness, what happens is you start hitting the dark triad. And that's like a very, that's antisocial behavior. In fact, most people that are in jail are really, really disagreeable. They tend to have a lot of antisocial behavior. And people that are way, way agreeable tend to have jobs like nursing and being teachers and that sort of thing. So the other thing, one of the things that agreeableness moderates well is also impulse control. And it does that by lowering risky behavior like promiscuity. And the reason why it does it is because people that are highly agreeable are generally more trustworthy and they're more straightforward. And by being those two things, and by expressing their desires, they're also less likely to engage in these sort of activities versus someone that's only goal-seeking and doesn't take the other person into account to the same degree as someone that's high in agreeableness. So I hope this gives you an idea of the Big Five and how to read it very quickly in a social dynamic situation. And then I've also created deep dives of each of these traits so you could really understand, what they're like from the inside and what the long-term consequences are. So I have all of these up here and then also in the description. And now part 3. This is going to be a very quick overview, but as you've noticed, this model is great. It's very, very scientifically validated. It's great at predicting long-term life outcomes. As they say, character is destiny. And if you know someone's Big Five, you're pretty good at assuming a lot of the things that will happen down the line for this person. Now, it's not perfect though. So what are some areas where we don't have complete knowledge? So it tells about half the story, and it tells the biological half the story, the way the person's wired, the way they're normally seeing the world. It gives us information about the filter. The thing that doesn't give us information, though, is about all the character adaptations, the parts of the personality that have changed throughout time. And that's a very important part because, in fact, that's when you ask someone who they are, they don't tell you I'm an extrovert. They usually tell you, I'm from California or I'm German. They tell you something about their culture. They tell you something about their beliefs and their attitudes, and those things inform them about their identity or their identities, because people have more than one identity. For example, could be a husband, it could be a father, it could be a doctor, it could be a brother, a son. It could be many different things at once. A great golf player, right? You have a lot of different identities. So, in some way, this is. The character adaptation part, which includes all the parts that they've learned from their environment, plus the things that they've brought on, like their culture, their belief system, their attitudes, their identity. That's a really big piece. So next, what we want to do in order to make the model better is get an understanding of how this dynamic works. And the most interesting part is that there's a direct relationship between a person's beliefs and how they see the world, and literally their worldview. And what's even more interesting than this, that there's an evolution where people move from one to the next level and so on and so forth. And this was covered by developmental psychologists back in the 70s and so on. So we're going to be looking at some of these models in the future, and we're going to overlay the two. We're going to overlay a developmental model and how people develop and change over time, how they evolve, because people are evolving from strategies that are not as effective to strategies that are more effective, right? Another way to think about it, they're also going from high effort strategies that are painful to low effort strategies that are joyful, right? And so we want to see how that development happens over time. And then we want to overlay the big five on it, and so we could know that how each trait expresses itself depending on its worldview. So for example, if someone is really extroverted, how would someone that's extroverted in a traditional worldview express themselves versus modern worldview versus postmodern worldview, and so on. So we'll take a look at that next, and that's how you can take the model to the next step. Hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.